Hi, class. So today in our lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the reasons why the United States really gets into World War One. And although the Lusitania itself, the sinking of it, which we will talk obviously about in this lesson, it's not like an immediate cause. It's the Germans' actions that are repeated and related to this sinking that helped to provoke the United States into going to war and joining the side of the Entente and allying with the British and the French. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is this event. So entering into World War One, the British, as we talked about on Friday, they had the world's dominant navy, and they use it immediately to their advantage. You might remember from the previous lesson that Britain they declared war, right? And the alliance system really took hold, and this web of alliances came into effect, and suddenly all of Europe was at war with one another. And what really forced Britain to go to war and to declare war on Germany was because Germany invaded the country of Belgium, which is north of France. It's south of the Netherlands, right? And it was an ally of the British. They had an alliance, an agreement with one another. And so, because of that, Britain declares war in August of 1914. And it was in November of 1914 that the British declare the entire North Sea area to be a war zone, which essentially is telling any ship basically come here at your own risk. If you come into these waters, you might be destroyed. And especially, you're not allowed to carry any type of contraband. And contraband are items that are prohibited. That's what contraband means. It's illegal, right? And so they included food as a contraband during the war. So this essentially began the blockade of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And that's what a blockade is. It's where you prevent goods coming in or out of Germany and Austria-Hungary. When you block off a country and prevent them from obtaining supplies from outside, from foreign countries. So this is the blockade of the Central Powers, and this had major implications for the war. And this blockade, it continued throughout the entire World War One. It essentially caused the Germans, or the Central Powers, especially the Germans and the Austrians as well, to have to ration their food. So we're talking about they had a ration down to like 1,000 calories a day for people. So just take a look at the number of calories in your average Big Mac or something, and think about just how little food that was per day that they had to ration down to. And there's many estimates of what that caused, what some of the effects were of that rationing. That obviously made it hard for the Central Powers, the Germans, right, and the Austrians, to get war munitions because of this blockade and things like that. But this blockade also made it very difficult for them to get food. And there are estimates that this rationing, this inability to get food, led to malnutrition, even led to starvation. And there's estimates that this might have led to in excess of 400,000 civilian deaths, either directly or indirectly due to malnutrition or starvation amongst the Central Powers. So this was a pretty serious tactic that was undertaken by the British. Now, the Germans, they did not have as dominant of a navy as the British. Most of their navy was actually focused right off the coast of Germany, right over here, right? And um, it it was like in the North Sea. That's what this region is right here in this part above Europe. That's called the North Sea. But they also wanted to disrupt trade with the British. That's what the Germans wanted to do. So they recognized the British Isles, right? The British Isles are right here in yellow, the United Kingdom, the British Isles. They recognize that they're islands, right? Because they're islands, they're dependent on trade for food and for supplies. So in February of 1915, the Germans declared the seas around the British Isles to be a war zone as well. And because their surface fleet was concentrated right over here, the way that they would enforce that, they would essentially try to keep people from trading with the British Isles through submarine warfare. So this means that the Germans were using U-boats, also called submarines, right? A U-boat is just an underwater boat, right? And in World War One, we're not talking incredibly complex submarines. They're kind of like, they're a relatively new innovation, so they're not that big and they're not that powerful as they are today or even in World War II. But still, they're underwater boats, right? And they're able to shoot torpedoes, right, and to sink ships. And World War One is the very first time that submarine warfare becomes a significant factor. So, like I said, we're talking about very primitive submarines. We're talking about these vessels that could go underwater and essentially send torpedoes into boats. Now, thinking about that, what I just described, thinking about that as a backdrop, we now go forward to May of 1915. So let's go to May of 1915. You have the passenger liner, the RMS Lusitania. And RMS literally stands for Royal Mail Ship because it carried some mail, right? It's a big ship. If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, think of a ship like that. And the RMS Lusitania was setting sail from New York to Liverpool, England, right? And it was apparently a passenger ship, meaning that it carried people, right? But it was also carrying cargo, carrying supplies, carrying materials. But the Germans, they said, look, this could be fair game for us, especially if it's carrying munitions. Munitions are weapons, right? Especially if it's a British ship, because they're at war with one another and they have that blockade going on. And in this advertisement, which you see right here on the right, um, they 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 put this in a New York newspaper for the Lusitania that was going to leave on May 1st, 1915. And the German embassy actually placed this advertisement. And this is worth reading. So it's going to be kind of blurry for you, but I'll read it to you. So they wrote, "Notice travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the water adjacent to the British Isles." So they're saying that the waters, the seas around Britain are a war zone. That in accordance with the formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. From the Imperial German Embassy. And this was dated April 1915. So that's the backdrop. So the Lusitania set sail May 1st, 1915. On May 7th, 1915, um, the number 15 keeps jumping into my brain. Sorry. On May 7th, 1915, it's almost reached its destination of Liverpool, right? So if we take a look at this map here, this is England, Scotland, Wales, and then this is the island of Ireland, right? And so they were planning to go from New York, which is obviously in the United States, and the ship was going to, its goal was to get to Liverpool, which is this part of England right here, right? And what ends up happening is it's almost reached its destination of Liverpool, and it's off the coast of Ireland, about right here on the south coast of Ireland. It's about 10 or 15 miles off the coast of Ireland. And right there, the Lusitania encounters a German U-boat, a German submarine. So this right here is what a U-boat looked like from World War One. And this German U-boat sends a torpedo into the Lusitania. Now, the torpedo, as you can imagine, right, it rams into the ship. And then shortly after the torpedo hits, you have this huge explosion. And the huge explosion is actually one of those question marks of history. Now, the ship goes down, taking down with it most of its passengers. So in total, there were 1,959 passengers and crew. and about 1,195 of them actually died. Now, there were other ships that went down as a result of German U boats, but what was famous about this one, at least from an American history point of view, is that there are 128 Americans who also died on board um, during the sinking. And so you can imagine this led to a lot of people, who became concerned on the American side. Why did this happen, right? These were American civilians that died, and it essentially led to a harsh reprimand. So you can see the sinking right here. This is an illustration of what it might have looked like based on survivors' accounts, witnesses. And so, like I said, the American position was a harsh reprimand. And by that, I mean that they scolded Germany. They said, what you just did was wrong. That was wrong. It was a strongly worded statement. And that was about it. Just a little bit of context here. Once war broke out, and war had broken out not even a year before the sinking of the Lusitania. Remember, I told you World War I started in 1914. This sank in 1915 in May. And during this time, the Americans' position was to be neutral. It did not want to enter into this European conflict. With that said, the Americans were disproportionately trading with the Allies, with the Triple Entente, with Britain and France. They were not trading with the Central Powers. The Americans were providing supplies at a minimum, at a trading level, and they were providing monetary support. They were providing loans to the British and the French, to the Allies, compared to the Central Powers, which they weren't really doing that at all. So even though there was this formal neutrality, this statement of neutrality that we want to stay out of it, there was more implicit connection between the United States and the Allies, right? There was a relationship there, and we were helping them to some extent. So Woodrow Wilson, he wants to keep America out of the war at this point. So we're talking about May 1915, and so he essentially just sends a stern warning to the German Empire, right? He doesn't want to get into the war. So he just sends a warning, says, you must apologize. You must take action to prevent this type of thing happening in the future. And the German Empire actually complies. They agree to not do that. They agree to apologize and to not do such a thing ever again, right? And that was on September 9th. So in May, you have the Lusitania sunk. And then in September, the Germans agree to not attack passenger ships. And so even though the sinking of the Lusitania, especially in a lot of US history classes, is often given as a trigger for America's entrance into the war, this whole thing happened, and America actually stayed neutral throughout this entire period. And America wouldn't actually enter the war until April 1917. So pretty much 2 years later. So the Lusitania was just one of many things that happened in the years leading up to the war. And if we fast forward a little bit, in 1916, the next presidential election where Woodrow Wilson won re-election, he ran on a platform of he kept us out of war. So the sinking of the Lusitania was a significant event, yes. One could argue because the Germans did not want the US to enter on the side of the Allies, it was why the Germans agreed to loosen up, at least for a couple of years, on their U-boat campaigns. And as we'll see, once we get into 1917, the Germans, they're so desperate, right? They're losing. They're remember, there's this blockade that's going on. The British aren't letting goods into Germany, right? And they're starving them out pretty much. And the Germans are desperate to do something, right? And they start to become more aggressive on their U-boat attacks, something called unrestricted submarine warfare, which pretty much means they don't care which flag you're flying. They don't care what type of ship you're supposed to be, whether you're carrying cargo, or maybe you're just carrying cargo, or maybe you're carrying weapons or soldiers. They didn't care. They were going to sink you if you entered those waters. So the Germans in 1917 become more aggressive on their attacks, which is really one of the catalysts that the US claims drove them into World War I. But with that said, just as a little bit of context, and oftentimes when we when we look back at history, it seems very cut and dry. It seems obvious. Oh yes, we had to go to war, etc., etc. And I have a couple quotes here from William Jennings Bryan, who was Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. And a few of these are pretty telling. So this first one is September 1914. This was before any of the stuff happened with the Lusitania, but war had broken out in Europe. And he had this message that he wrote to Woodrow Wilson to essentially advocate why we should stay out of the war and why there should be some type of mediation to try to get the war to end, as opposed to just letting it run its course. And he wrote to Wilson this: "It is not likely that either side will win so complete a victory as to be able to dictate terms. And if either side does win such a victory, it will probably mean preparation for another war. It would seem better to look for a more rational basis for peace." Now, the other quote here, and this is the question mark around that second explosion, William Jennings Bryan wrote, "Ships carrying contraband should be prohibited from carrying passengers. It would be like putting women and children in front of an army." And so this is one of those big questions of history. It was known that the Lusitania was carrying light munitions. So it was carrying light munitions. Now, the Germans claimed that it was actually carrying heavy munitions, right? And to some degree, that second explosion that I mentioned earlier tends to back that up, that huge explosion. And there was all sorts of shady things about a lot of the cargo that the Lusitania was carrying. Even though they claimed that it was these perishable goods, it wasn't being stored in a refrigerated part of the ship. And so there was reason to believe that it was actually carrying heavy munitions. And that second explosion seems to point in that direction as well. And then even after World War I, the British Navy actually spent multiple times trying to destroy the wreck of the Lusitania. And some people say in order to maybe get rid of some evidence that it was actually carrying far more munitions and maybe was, from the Germans' point of view, a fairer target than was actually made out to be. So regardless, it's a very interesting incident, not necessarily directly tied to America's entrance into World War I, but it's one of many events, right? It's not just the singular event that caused us to enter the war. Unlike in World War II with like Pearl Harbor, for example, that was an immediate cause. The Lusitania, it's not really, but the German response was they weren't going to do something like this ever again. And guess what? They end up doing something like this again. They end up sinking other ships. They engage in unrestricted submarine warfare. And so because they go back on their commitment, their promise, that's what causes the United States to ultimately join the war, which I will talk much more in detail about in an upcoming lesson. And so this whole idea of blockades and German U-boats against civilians, this was something that was a cause of repeated concern for the Americans. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. So that's going to be it for this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll make sure to try to help you.